Wells of Silence by TheBeckster, Chapter 24. Anakin landed her speeder in a seldom-used bay. Her gut twisted painfully, and she practically shook from fear and nerves. At least she wouldn't have to fake that. Rage simmered in the pit of her stomach, waiting to be called forth. She was a mess of emotions, and she wasn't bothering to hide it. The confusion would sever her well. She walked quickly, not bothering with circuitous routes, and only barely maintaining a semblance of normalcy by not outright sprinting. She knew she'd never avoid detection, but she had to get to Mace Windu. A direct path was her best option. However, she'd consider herself extremely lucky if she found the master before anyone else identified her. Anakin mentally ran out over her upcoming lines as she walked as briskly as she dared through the halls. She had a response for any question the Jedi might throw at her. She had prepared herself to do and say whatever she must to protect her family. She turned a corner and nearly ran into a couple temple guards on their rounds. They hesitated for the briefest second, giving Anakin the chance to turn and run, before they gave chase. Unfortunately for Anakin's plans of keeping a low profile, her second route was more populated. She sprinted past Kit Fisto, and the Natilian gave chase as well, calling after her to stop. Anakin knew this was a race she couldn't win. It was only a matter of time before the entire temple was on alert and she would be outnumbered. Luckily, after another minute of the chase, she found her mark. Mace was pacing a corridor, discussing something with Sassy Tin. "Master Windu, I must speak with you," she demanded, skidding to a halt. The temple guards were right behind her, and grabbed her as soon as she was within reach. Anakin didn't fight their grasp. She stared right into Mace's eyes, while she caught her breath, willing him to see the urgency in her actions. Windu regarded her critically for a long moment, then he gestured to the guards to release her. "Speak." Anakin straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and took a deep breath. "Chancellor Palpatine is a Sith Lord." She could feel a surprise course through the Jedi. Even Windu was surprised, though it barely registered as a twitch on his brow. How do you know this?" he asked, studying her intensely. Anakin could feel him probing her emotions, and she didn't bother trying to cover them up. For the first time in over 10 years, no longer being a Jedi was so liberating. "He told me. He tried to turn me to the dark side." Windu narrowed his eyes at her. "And did he?" Anakin had expected him to be blunt. She had properly buried her true intentions before she even set foot in the temple. "I wouldn't be here if he had," she lied smoothly. "I want my family safe. I don't want the Republic in the hands of the Sith." Mace stared at her for a long moment before he conceded. He looked to the other two Jedi Masters. "We'll take the Chancellor alive." "You won't be a match for him," Anakin insisted. "Let me go with you." "No, I sense much turmoil in you, Skywalker. Stay here." Windu's command was quick and dismissive. He barely gave her a second glance before he turned away from her. Kit Fisto and Sassy Tin shared a look before following. Anakin could tell the other masters weren't convinced she shouldn't come, but they weren't about to voice an argument at such a critical moment. To take down the Sith Lord, they all needed to be united. Anakin pressed her lips together but stepped back, all according to plan. The three masters were all expert swordsmen. If it had been anyone other than Sidious, she knew they would have been more than adequate. The masters hurried off to a ship, and Anakin was left alone with her temple guards as an escort. She crossed her arms to stop her hands from fidgeting and turned to the sentinels. "Don't suppose I'd be allowed to go back to my old quarters?" she asked, letting a hint of skeptic hope tinge her voice. "I left a few personal items there I'd like to have." The guard said nothing, but Anakin had a feeling the answer was no. Then again, sentinels were especially trained to be unreadable, and their masks didn't help aid in communication. She huffed and let her arms flop to her side in exasperation before they settled on her hips. "Can I go sit in some meditation chambers? Or are we just going to stand here all night?" The sentinels shared a look before they turned and beckoned her to follow. Their little procession garnered more than a few curious looks, but Anakin kept her eyes fixed on her escorts. Throwing thinly veiled hostile glares around wouldn't do much to benefit her at the moment. Anakin was quite surprised when they led her past several empty meditation rooms, but she followed them without raising any more questions until they stopped at the entrance of the council's chambers. It was certainly a room she never thought she'd set foot in again after her children were born. The doors opened for her, showing the empty, sun-drenched room. Anakin stepped inside. Temple guards didn't accompany her. She didn't expect them to. Anakin noted with a twist of ire that they had removed her seat, and probably had done so as soon as Obi-Wan reported on her. No matter, by tomorrow's dawn the temple wouldn't belong to the Jedi, and this entire tower could be hers to do with as she pleased. She was currently favoring dreams of complete demolition. Anakin dropped into Obi-Wan's chair and slouched down, resting her chin on her fist. From the seat she had a clear view across the city to the Senate building. The sun began to sink below the horizon, and the sky was painted fiery orange and blood red. Anakin watched a drop ship leave the temple and head toward the Senate building. It was only a matter of time now. There were hardly any Jedi left in the temple anymore. All of the able-bodied knights and masters were out fighting the war or searching for Grievous. Windu would have taken the last few fighters left to face Palpatine. That left the injured, the elderly, and the young in the temple. It was almost too easy. The only real threat would be the temple guards, and they could easily be overwhelmed. Anakin was broken out of her dark ruminations when the chamber doors slid open. She straightened on instinct and turned to face the intruder. Shaak Ti stood in the doorway, her arms folded into the sleeves of her robes, a neutral expression on her face. "I should have known they sent a babysitter," Anakin grumbled, dropping her chin back into her hand, doing her best to look bored. "On the contrary, I have come on my own volition," T said placidly, stepping fully into the room. I thought there were rules about Jedi interacting with the exiled," she quipped as Master T settled herself into her own chair. "Since when have you cared about the rules, Skywalker?" Shaak immediately rebutted. Anakin could have sworn she heard a hint of humor hiding in her words. "Touché," Anakin admitted. With a small shrug, she turned her gaze back out the window, quite content to let the conversation die. She didn't want or need Shaak Ti looming over her while she waited for her master's signal. Unfortunately for her, the Togruta had different plans. "How are your children?" Anakin tried not to glare as she looked at the master. They're fine. They're nearly a month old, are they not? 1 month, tomorrow. Have you gotten a midichlorian count for them yet? T voiced it like an innocent question, but Anakin's anger flared in her stomach. This time she didn't hide the steely glare she sent the master. No. What business did she have asking such questions anyways? It's not like she'd give up her children to the Jedi, not after the way they treated her. She wasn't going to abandon them to become emotionless tools for the Jedi Order. Shaak Ti hardly flinched at Anakin's hard glare, but she did fall silent. Both the women turned their gazes back out the windows. The sun was half hidden behind the horizon. Sidious's message was supposed to come shortly after sunset. Anakin glanced back to the Torgruda. If Master T was going to be her first victim of the night, then so be it. Do you have any regrets? The question came out of the blue, and Anakin found herself shocked out of her dark thoughts. What? Do you have any regrets about the path you have chosen? Shaak Ti asked again. Her eyes seemed to bore into Anakin. Anakin shifted in her seat uncomfortably. Are you gathering evidence for my trial? She asked sharply. What did T want her to do? Confess everything to her so the council could forego her trial? It's not like they didn't have Obi-Wan's testimony against her already. No, I'm simply trying to see the situation from your perspective. Anakin scoffed slightly, but settled back into her seat. No, I'd do it all again. Even if I was given 100 chances, I'd choose them every time. Her words had a harsh, bitter edge. She didn't believe the master for 1 second, but if T wanted her confession, then she would give it. In a few hours, it wouldn't matter anyway. Shaak nodded silently and turned her gaze back out the window. The sun was now barely a sliver on the horizon. Across the city, Anakin could sense her children wake, hungry for dinner. They were soothed in a matter of minutes. She centered herself on them. Everything she would do would be for them. Her children would not be slaughtered by the Jedi. You know, not everyone on the council wanted to see you expelled, T said after a long silence. And yet here we are. Shaak Ti hummed softly. There were some on the council who saw from the beginning that you were never meant for the following traditional path of the Jedi. Yeah, I know, I'm the chosen one and all that. She scoffed. Half the council didn't even want to allow me to become a Jedi in the first place. Anakin rolled her eyes and glared out the window again. Her anxiety was building. She should have seen the signal by now, not to mention Shaak Ti and her unshakable placidity was really beginning to grate on her nerves. I still have a lot to offer the Order, you know, she finally snapped. T followed Anakin's gaze across the city to the Senate building. I know you wanted to accompany Master Windu to confront Palpatine, but you have an obligation to your family now, Anakin. Would you really want to divide your time between your children and the Jedi? Anakin scowled and prepared a sharp retort, but it died in her throat. She could sense Sidious was struggling. Her heart clenched painfully, as if someone had it trapped in their fist and was squeezing it tightly. She shot out of her seat, heart pounding, breathing heavily. Master Skywalker? Shaak Ti sat upright in her seat, looking quite alarmed by her sudden outburst. What is wrong? She had to go, now. She had to save her master. Anakin spun around and marched for the door, trying to muster an appropriate excuse that would get her out of the temple. I have to go. My children need me. Go, Master T said with soft insistence. When Master Windu returns, I will tell him where to find you. Anakin sprinted to her speeder, praying to every god she had ever heard of that she wasn't going to be too late. She needed her master alive if he was ever going to help her save her children. She caught a few curious and concerned looks in her sprint through the temple, but she ignored them entirely. When she reached her speeder, she bolted in and shot off to the Senate building. Her feet knew the way to the Chancellor's offices. She hardly had to think as she sprinted through the familiar corridors. She burst into the Red Office, nearly tripping over the bodies of Kit, Sassy, and Ajin Kular. Windu had Sidious cornered, trapped on the ledge of a broken window. The wind howled and the force lightning flashed, nearly blinded her as it flew from Sidious's fingers and rebounded off Windu's blade. Her master was weakening as the lightning struck him, but he was determined to outlast the Jedi. Master! Anakin rushed forward, and the lightning stopped. Both men were drained. They gasped for breath in the interruption. Palpatine looked much worse than Windu. He collapsed back against the ledge, his hands shaking violently. Windu leveled his blade at Sidious, unwavering. He didn't even look up at Anakin. Skywalker, help me bring him into custody. Anakin activated her lightsaber, but held it to Windu's neck instead. His shock was immediate as he looked to her, but he kept his blade on the Sith Lord. What are you doing? Anakin fixed him with a steely glare. Protecting my family. Windu stiffened and a furious expression crossed his face as he recognized her betrayal. He knew he had been beat, and he deactivated his saber and dropped it to the floor. Anakin kicked it out the window. On your knees, hands behind your head. Windu complied, moving slowly. Palpatine pulled himself to his feet and stood beside Anakin. She tried not to stare at the damage the lightning had done, but it was difficult. His face looked like it had melted and then was reshaped by someone who only had a vague grasp of what a human face should look like. Excellent work, Lord Vader. Anakin heard Windu breathe in sharply as he stared out into the city. Why? The Jedi asked. His tone was low and angry, and Anakin could sense the rage coursing through him. Shut up, she snapped. Don't pretend you didn't see this coming. I know about the plot against my family, against my children. What are you talking about, Skywalker? Windu glared up at her. You said you wanted to protect your children. How is siding with the Sith possibly going to do that? Anakin snarled and kicked Windu in the back. The Jedi didn't have a chance to catch himself before his face smashed into the floor. She ground her boot in between his shoulder blades and pressed him into the shards of transparent steel that littered the floor. Windu groaned in pain, but didn't try to fight her off. The Sith don't want to kill my children. Lord Vader, Sidious commanded sternly. Enough. Anakin growled, pressing harder before stepping away from Windu. Master, you cannot leave him alive. Patience, my apprentice. He will die, but not by your hand. You have other, more pressing matters to attend to tonight. Anakin swallowed and watched Mace push himself back up. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at the temple. She was supposed to lead her 501st into battle against the Jedi. She was supposed to go to Mustafar after the Jedi were killed. But if not for her, Sidious would be dead. He owed her this. Master, please. Windu had risen to his feet. He wavered a bit unsteadily. Blood dripped steadily from his face. But he slid into a confident fighting stance. Anakin knew that he could still be a formidable threat, even unarmed and in his weakened state. Palpatine looked at her indulgently, as if she was a child begging for a treat. Very well, my apprentice. With hardly a flick of his wrist, and no warning, Force lightning shot from his hands again and flew towards Windu. Only this time the Jedi didn't have his lightsaber to block the blow. It hit him full force. He convulsed. A strangled, agonized scream ripped from his lungs. It only took a few short seconds and Windu had stumbled back to the window ledge. It was a simple matter of a push in the lightning that sent him falling out of the window and to his death. Anakin's heart clenched tightly, but relaxed significantly once she could no longer sense the Jedi's strong presence. Windu was dead. He couldn't orchestrate any further plots to kill her children. They were going to be safe. Palpatine turned towards Anakin. Now, go about your duty, my apprentice. You have much to do tonight, if you want your children to be saved. She bowed deeply. Yes, Master. Thank you. Storming the temple was easier than Anakin had expected. There was resistance, but inexperienced Padawans and elders were no match for an entire battalion. The 501st swept into the temple like a tsunami. The sentinels at the front gates were the first to fall to Anakin's saber that night, but they wouldn't be the last. The alarm was raised quickly. The few remaining knights, sentinels, and inexperienced Padawans rushed to defend the temple. Her clones had their orders, and while Anakin created a distraction at the front, several squads broke off and slipped deeper into the temple. Their targets were the nurseries and creches. Anakin allowed this small mercy for the younglings to be killed quickly and quietly while they slept in their beds. She and the majority of her troopers marched directly through the temple. Blaster fire rained mercilessly around her, and her saber cut down anyone who was unlucky enough to avoid being shot. Elders, guards, acolytes, Padawans, wayward younglings, it didn't matter. They could stand their ground or run, screaming. Neither action saved them. Her blade cut them all down. Explosions rocked the temple. Clones had made it to the hangars and were eliminating any means of escape. She knew that every exit was being blocked by armed clones, firing indiscriminately. She could sense the growing desperation of the Jedi who thought they could get out of this trap. There would be no escape. Throughout it all, Anakin felt nothing. There was no more rage burning her up, just an empty desperation. She couldn't stop to think about her actions. If she stopped, she'd never complete her mission. If she failed, her children would be killed. Numbness seeped into her very bones as she moved automatically through the temple. She cut through any resistance easily, mechanically. There was no remorse, no regret, but there wasn't any enjoyment either. She had to save her children. She had to save Padme. This was the only way. Uneven, limping steps accompanied by the patter of many pairs of feet caught Anakin's ear, and she turned to look down the corridor. Several relieved gasps reached her ear as she saw a group of younglings being led by Tara Sinube and a young Padawan girl. She might have still been an initiate. Knight Skywalker's here. We're saved! A couple of younglings expressed, surging forward to join with Anakin. They were all stopped as Sinube threw out his arms to stop them. Even the Padawan looked confused and hurt as the elder stopped her. Run, Sinube ordered before stepping forward. His pale lightsaber ignited in his hands, and he fell into a defensive stance. Master? The Padawan asked waveringly. Get them to safety, Celia. Go. The Padawan didn't argue and ushered the younglings back in the direction they had come from. Anakin didn't care. They weren't going to get far. She advanced on Sunube just as a squad of clones rounded the corner in front of the retreating younglings. The Elder Master got in a few decent blocks and parries before the clones opened fire. No! He turned back to look after the younglings. The Padawan was doing her best to deflect shots, but the younglings around her were dropping quickly. Sunube's moment of distraction cost him his life as Anakin sliced through his stomach. She didn't even bother to look at the fallen elder as she advanced on the remaining younglings. Only a Twi'lek boy who had managed to find shelter cowering behind the Padawan had survived. Anakin impaled him and the Padawan with one swift stroke. "What have you done?" a familiar voice cried from the end of the corridor. Anakin turned to Shaak Ti. The Togruta master had her saber in hand, the blue light casting her horrified face into sharp shadows. 4 temple guards accompanied her. Their weapons were at the ready. Shaak Ti's eyes widened in horror as she saw Anakin's face. "Skywalker, what are you doing?" Anakin said nothing. She simply adjusted her grip on her lightsaber, took a breath, and leapt for the Jedi. Anything to save Padme, anything to save her children. Anything. End of chapter.